My father-in-law thought I was an easy target. He believed that after losing my husband, I was 30 years old, alone, frightened, and too emotionally broken to challenge a man like him. He was wrong about almost everything. What he did not know was that the quiet house he planned to enter at midnight was the one place where I had spent months learning exactly what Daniel had been hiding from his family. My name is Emma Carter, and 3 months ago, my husband Daniel died suddenly in a highway accident. I was 30 years old, and Daniel had been 38. We had been married for 6 years. His family had never completely accepted me, but Daniel had always stood between me and his father's controlling behavior. He used to tell me that Richard measured people by money, property, and control. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. After the funeral, I realized he had been warning me. Richard did not wait for the flowers to disappear before showing me who he really was. 4 days after Daniel's funeral, he arrived at my house with Daniel's older brother, Jason. Neither man brought food. Neither asked if I had slept. Richard walked through my living room, studying the furniture, walls, and framed photographs like he was deciding what belonged to him. Then he placed a thick folder on my kitchen table. "You are still young, Emma," he said calmly. "You don't understand how complicated Daniel's estate is. Sign these papers, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." I looked at the folder without touching it. "What are they?" asked. Richard smiled. "Transfer documents. The house, accounts, and Daniel's investment interests need to remain with the family." My hands were shaking, but not because I was afraid. I had spent the previous week reading every document Daniel had left behind. I knew the house was legally mine. I knew his life insurance had named me as the beneficiary. Most importantly, I knew Daniel had left one sealed envelope with my name on it. I told Richard the first would speak to a lawyer before signing anything. His smile disappeared. Jason leaned against the wall and laughed. "You really think you can handle this?" he asked. "You're 30, Emma. You have no idea how ruthless Dad can be when he wants something." Richard stepped closer. "Your husband is gone. The family is all you have now." I looked directly into his eyes. "No," I said quietly. "Daniel was my family." Richard snatched the folder from the table and warned me that refusing him would make things difficult. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "People like you survive by knowing when to stop fighting." I watched his car disappear, then locked the door behind him. For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something stronger than grief. Felt suspicion. That night, I opened Daniel's sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a small brass key. The note contained one sentence: "If Dad ever comes after the house, trust no one and open the box." My heart stopped for a moment. Daniel had known something was coming. The key belonged to a safety deposit box I had never known existed. The next morning I went to the bank alone. Inside the box were financial records, photographs, and a flash drive. The records showed that Richard had been moving money from Daniel's company for years. There were transfers, hidden accounts, and signatures Daniel had marked as suspicious. But one page made my blood run cold. Richard had recently taken out a massive private loan using Daniel's identity as security. If Daniel's estate remained untouched, the fraud could be exposed. Suddenly, the house wasn't just a house. It was the last obstacle between Richard and the evidence that could destroy him. That evening, I installed new locks and checked every security camera Daniel had secretly placed around the property. I still missed my husband every morning. But I was no longer confused. Grief had changed me, and fear no longer controlled my decisions. Richard believed I was an easy target because he saw a grieving widow standing alone. He didn't understand that I had already discovered the secret he was desperate to keep buried. At 11:47 p.m., I turned off the downstairs lights and sat silently in the dark. I knew Richard would come. I just didn't know how far he was willing to go. Then, at exactly midnight, something scraped against my back door. I heard the lock move. I did not call out. I did not panic. I reached for the phone beside me and whispered, "He's here." The scrape came again, louder this time. I could hear metal grinding against the lock on the back door. Richard wasn't trying to hide anymore. He believed the darkness belonged to him. I stayed completely still in the upstairs hallway, watching the security monitor beside me. 2 figures appeared on the screen. Richard was standing near the kitchen door, and Jason was beside him carrying a flashlight and a black bag. My stomach tightened when I saw the tools in Richard's hands. They hadn't come to talk. They had come prepared. I watched as Richard finally forced the lock open. The door swung inward with a sharp crack, and both men stepped inside. Jason whispered, "Are you sure she's asleep?" Richard gave a quiet laugh. "Of course she is. She's been crying for 3 months. She won't even know what's happening until it's over." I felt my jaw tighten. He had no idea I was watching every movement. They moved through my kitchen, careful at first, but Richard quickly became confident. He knew exactly where Daniel had kept important documents. "The study," he whispered. "Find the desk. The estate papers should be there." Jason opened drawers while Richard searched shelves. Then Richard said something that made my blood run cold. "We need the flash drive too." I immediately understood. They knew about Daniel's evidence. Somehow they knew there was something hidden. That meant someone had told them. Someone who knew about the safety deposit box. I stepped backward silently and checked the second camera. Jason was now opening Daniel's desk while Richard searched the cabinets. "What if she wakes up?" Jason asked. Richard answered without hesitation. "She won't fight us. Emma is 30, alone and grieving. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her when she realizes what we're willing to do." Those words confirmed everything. They didn't just want the house. They wanted to erase the evidence. I picked up my phone and started recording. Then I walked slowly down the stairs. I deliberately allowed one floorboard to creak beneath my foot. Both men froze. Jason turned his flashlight toward the staircase. "Emma," he whispered. I didn't answer. Richard looked upward and smiled. "See, told you. She'll be terrified." He stepped forward. "Emma, sweetheart, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We only need a few signatures." I finally stepped into the faint light. "You broke into my house at midnight for signatures?" "Yes." Richard's expression changed for half a second, but then he recovered. "You shouldn't have made us come this far." I looked at Jason. "Did you really think this was a good idea?" Jason lowered his eyes. Richard stepped closer. "Give me the flash drive, Emma." My heart jumped. I hadn't told anyone about it. "So you know about that?" "Yes." Richard's face went completely still. That tiny reaction told me more than any confession could have. I pressed the phone deeper into my pocket, keeping the recording active. "Who told you about the drive?" "Yes." Richard didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the folder from the table and threw it toward me. "Sign the transfer documents." I glanced at the papers. They were fake. Daniel's signature was already printed on several pages. "You forged his signature," I said. Jason immediately looked at his father. Richard snapped. "Shut up." That was the moment I knew I had them. But I didn't reveal it. I wanted them to keep talking. I wanted the truth recorded in their own voices. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. "Fine," I said. "Tell me what happens if I refuse." Richard's confidence returned. "Then you lose everything. The house, the accounts, Daniel's investments. And if necessary, you'll be blamed for the missing money." I looked at him and realized his plan was bigger than I had imagined. He wasn't simply stealing from me. He was preparing to make me the criminal. Then Jason spoke. "Dad, this isn't what you said we'd do." Richard turned toward him with a warning glare. "Jason, don't start." Jason's voice became shaky. "You said we were only taking the house to pay the lender. You didn't say we'd frame Emma." Richard grabbed his arm. "You want to go to prison too?" Silence filled the kitchen. I let them argue for another few seconds before quietly asking, "How much do you owe?" Richard released Jason and looked at me. For the first time, fear appeared behind his eyes. None of your business. Then why risk breaking into my house? Yes. He said nothing. I leaned forward. You didn't come here for the house, Richard. You came here because you're desperate. His face hardened. You have no idea what you're talking about. But I already knew I was close. The security camera was still recording. My phone was still recording. And Daniel's evidence was hidden somewhere they would never find. Richard stepped toward me one final time and whispered, "You should have signed those papers when I gave you the chance." I looked straight into his eyes and replied, "And you should never have walked through that door." Richard stared at me as if he was trying to decide whether I was bluffing. For the first time since he had entered my house, he wasn't looking at me like a grieving widow. He was looking at me like a problem he couldn't understand. Jason stood behind him, pale and nervous, still holding the flashlight. "Dad," he whispered, "let's just leave." Richard ignored him. "Where is the drive?" he demanded. I leaned back in my chair. "You already searched Daniel's office. You checked the drawers, the shelves, and even the safe. If you knew about the drive, you should know it's not there." Richard's face tightened. "Then where is it?" I smiled slightly. "Why don't you tell me what was on it?" He froze. That silence gave me the answer I needed. He knew exactly what Daniel had discovered. Richard suddenly lunged toward the table and grabbed my wrist. "Enough games." His fingers tightened around my arm, but I didn't pull away immediately. I wanted him to keep talking. "You're going to sign those documents," he said. "Then you're going to give me everything Daniel left behind." Jason stepped forward. "Dad, you're hurting her." Richard shoved him away. "Stay out of this." I looked at Jason and said quietly, "You still have a chance to walk away." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I reached into my pocket and placed my phone on the table. The screen was facing Richard. "Everything you've said tonight has been recorded." Richard's expression changed instantly. Jason stared at the phone. "You recorded us. From the moment you broke my door," I answered. "And the cameras recorded the rest." Richard's confidence vanished for a moment, but then he laughed. "You think a recording is going to save you? You're a grieving widow who assaulted 2 members of her own family." I shook my head. "I haven't assaulted anyone." He looked toward Jason. "Tell them she attacked us." Jason didn't answer. "Jason!" Richard shouted. Jason lowered his head. "I can't lie anymore." Richard's face turned red. "You're my son. And you're going to destroy both of us," Jason replied. The room became silent. I could see the battle inside him. He wasn't innocent, but he was frightened. I pressed play on the recording. Richard's own voice filled the room, clearly explaining that the house was needed because the lender was demanding repayment. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Once she signs, we sell it and cover the loan before anyone finds out what I did with Daniel's money." Richard stared at the phone. "Turn that off." I didn't. His confession continued. He admitted that he had borrowed money using Daniel's identity and had altered financial documents after Daniel refused to help him. The amount was far larger than I had expected. Nearly $400,000 had disappeared through accounts connected to Richard's private business. Daniel had discovered the missing money shortly before his death. That explained the envelope. It explained the safety deposit box. It explained why Richard had moved so quickly after the funeral. But one question remained. I looked at him and asked, "Did you have anything to do with Daniel's death?" Jason immediately looked at his father. Richard's eyes widened. "No," his answer came too quickly. "I didn't kill him." I studied his face. "I didn't accuse you of killing him. You just did." Richard stepped backward. For the first time he looked genuinely terrified. "Emma, listen to me. Daniel's accident was an accident." I stood up slowly. "Then you shouldn't be afraid of the police hearing this conversation." I reached beneath the table and pressed a small button. The security alarm activated throughout the house. A loud siren filled the hallway. Richard jumped. "What did you do?" I called for help before you entered. His face went pale. You knew we were coming. I looked at the security monitor. I knew someone was coming. That was the truth. Daniel had installed the cameras months earlier because he suspected someone was watching the house. I had discovered the system after his death. Since Richard's first visit, I had been saving every piece of evidence. Then headlights appeared through the front windows. Richard rushed toward the back door, but Jason blocked him. Don't run, Dad. Richard pushed him aside. I stepped between them and said, It's over. Sirens grew louder outside. Richard looked at me with disbelief. You planned this. I shook my head. No, you planned it. I simply stopped being the woman you thought I was. Seconds later, police officers entered through the front door. Richard immediately started shouting that I had attacked him and that he had come to protect family property. But before he could finish, I handed an officer my phone, then pointed toward the security cameras. Everything is recorded. The officer looked at Richard, then at the broken back door. Sir, step away from her. Richard finally understood that the house he had entered believing it belonged to a helpless widow had become the place where his entire secret was about to come crashing down. The officers separated Richard and Jason and began asking questions while another officer inspected the shattered lock on the back door. Richard kept insisting that I had misunderstood everything, but his own words were already trapped inside the recording on my phone. I stood near the kitchen counter, watching the man who had spent weeks trying to frighten me finally realize that intimidation meant nothing anymore. One officer asked me to explain what had happened. I told him everything from Richard's first visit after Daniel's funeral to the moment they forced their way into my home. Then I showed him the documents Richard had brought, the forged signature on the transfer papers, and the financial records Daniel had hidden in the safety deposit box. When the officer compared Daniel's real signature with the one on the documents, his expression changed. This isn't a transfer, he said. This looks like an attempt to fraudulently take control of the estate. Richard immediately interrupted. Those papers are family business. The officer looked at him calmly. Not when you break into someone's house to obtain them. Jason stood silently beside the wall. He looked exhausted. Finally, he told the officers that his father had planned the entire break-in. He admitted that Richard had promised him money if they could force me to sign the house over. Richard shouted that Jason was lying, but his son continued. He told them about the private lender, the missing money, the forged documents, and the pressure Richard had placed on him. Then he admitted something that made my stomach twist. Richard had been planning to blame me for the missing funds if the house sale failed. He had already prepared a story that I had manipulated Daniel before his death and secretly transferred money out of the company. He wanted me to look like the criminal so nobody would question him. The police took Richard and Jason into custody that night. Before leaving, one officer asked me if I wanted to press charges for the break-in. I looked at the broken door, then at the photographs of Daniel hanging on the wall. 3 months earlier, I would have been terrified of making a decision like that. Now I knew exactly what I wanted. Yes, I said. Every charge that applies. Richard stopped at the doorway and looked back at me. The arrogance was gone from his face. Emma, please, he said. We are family. I stared at him for several seconds. Family doesn't break into someone's home at midnight and threaten them for money. He had nothing to say after that. The officers led him away. The investigation grew much larger over the following weeks. Daniel's financial records were examined by investigators, and the evidence from the safety deposit box helped uncover years of hidden transactions. Richard had been using Daniel's identity to secure loans and move money through accounts connected to his business. The amount eventually discovered was over $380,000. The documents he had brought into my home were only the beginning. The recording from that night, the security footage, the forged signatures, and Jason's testimony created a chain of evidence Richard couldn't explain away. The lender also provided investigators with additional documents showing that Richard had been under enormous financial pressure. He had believed that selling my house would give him enough money to delay the collapse of his entire operation. Instead, his desperate decision to enter my home had exposed everything. Jason eventually received a reduced sentence after cooperating with investigators, but Richard faced multiple serious charges. Watching the case unfold was strange. Part of me wanted to celebrate every piece of bad news that reached him, but another part of me was simply tired. Daniel was still gone. No arrest could change that. No courtroom victory could bring him back. What I had gained wasn't revenge. It was freedom from the fear that had followed me since his funeral. 6 months after the break-in, I sold the house. I kept only the photographs, Daniel's letters, and the small brass key from the safety deposit box. I moved to a quiet town near the coast, somewhere Daniel and I had once talked about visiting. The first morning I woke there, the sunlight came through the window, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like someone was waiting outside my door. I eventually understood something Daniel had tried to teach me while he was alive. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to let someone convince you that you are powerless. Richard looked at my age, my grief, and my loneliness and decided those things made me easy to control. He never bothered to learn who I really was. And that mistake became his downfall. I didn't defeat him by becoming cruel like him. I defeated him by staying calm, keeping the evidence, and refusing to surrender what Daniel had trusted me to protect. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, and your own family entered your home at midnight demanding everything your spouse left behind, would you stay calm like I did, or would you confront them immediately? Tell me where you're watching from and what you would have done. And if this story kept you watching until the end, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about betrayal, hidden secrets, and the people who discover that the person they underestimated was the one person they should never have challenged.